All right, thank you all for attending our third SRE Forum / workshop. Today for our session, I think we're going to go a little bit into some previous geopolitical reports I and some others made for SRE. And the reason why I'd like to bring it up today in this session is really because I think that people don't understand what exactly is going on with our community right now. I think that in general, there is this false belief that we are ever expanding, ever growing in our Rusynness and in our identity and culture. So I'd like to be a little bit of a pessimist, but also a bit of an optimist at the end, and kind of describing what's going on. So first, I think that it's important here to understand why exactly these two in this next part of the lecture is so vital to the current Russian condition. And really, it's because, as you can see here, Vanishing Youth, we have limited time. And people say, if you go to the homeland, you'll hear people say, oh, the young people aren't very interested in taking over these organizations and things like that. But I mean, in a more broad scale, we can see across all domains of the Russian community and society, this dearth of leadership and potential. And I believe this really began in the late 2000s, and it's only progressed further to today. But from my understanding, and you can read this geopolitical report if you're more interested, we have about 20 years left to really change the situation. That is, the organizations that we already have, if you look from the wide scale, we are constantly either merging or closing organizations year after year. And with that, we have a decreased ability to project we have limited power, but we have a decreased ability to project the power that we have into the domains that we need to, whether this be politics, culture, etc. And so just keep this in mind as we go forward, of that, well, why am I bringing up this next point? It's precisely because we only have, I think, roughly 20 years left. Another generation in Zakarpattia is looking like almost everyone will be assimilated by then. In Priyashiv, they are, of course, not going to be assimilated per se, but we just don't have enough young people as writers, as activists. And in Lemkovina, the story is very much the same. So with that in mind, let's go to the main topic of this speech. And it is the false myth of Russian growth and effective action. This is really two things here. It is the belief that we are constantly growing, like I said earlier, and also that the actions we are taking right now are effective and are leading for change. And I talk about this very specifically in the first ever geopolitical report that we had, the embedded Stasis obligations. And I'll get to what that means in a little bit, but I lay out the case for why I believe Russian society has essentially stagnated, and not just about the youth, but just in general in all domains. And we can kind of go over here. You can see more exactly what the article says. But my reasoning is precisely this: is that we can go down the list here, and I'll explain more. While the total amount of Rusyns increased in the 2021 Slovak census, the number of speakers has decreased. And now this range is not just 500 less speakers, it is in the thousands. And particularly, Rusyns that put down their first identity as Rusyn had also decreased by, I think, roughly 10,000. There's been no major geopolitical change for Rusyns in the last 15 years, and the recognition of Rusyns in Ukraine is in no better of a situation. And really, this war has only exacerbated this situation in Zakarpattia, as we can see, of course, with the raid of the Orthodox Church in Uzhhorod, and a number of other things. In reality, when you see a lot of these top organizations, such as the World Congress of Rusyns, the carpatho-rusyn Consortium in North America, they don't have much evidence to show for any progress. The World Congress has kind of devolved over time, and the consortium we'll get into later. But this next point here of the average age of membership in diaspora organizations has risen to almost retirement age. And I would say it's not only below 10%, but it's probably below 5% by now. I was a board member for CRS for, I wouldn't say 2 years, but it was almost 2 years, something along the lines. And I got to be very familiar with the membership of that organization. And I'd count people who are active and enrolled probably 2 to 3%. And this is the largest Rusyn organization in North America. Of course, also too, we can look at, I can keep going here. I mean, there's no Gen Z or early millennial founders or community leaders of organizations. You know, this is very apparent to anyone who's paying attention. The World Congress of Rusyns, and also too, we can see that the structure of Rusyn society has only fragmented over time. If you look at 1991, it was never necessary that you had one or organization per region, but you had a very concentrated group that worked together to try to accomplish something. In Zakarpattia, you probably have 15 organizations with no clear goal, with no real membership base, and essentially just doing a couple cultural activities every year and then saying that this is activism. And of course, when we talk about growth, we also can't forget the political aspect, because there's still no Rusyn political parties or organizations 30 years after. And the only reason why there is a minority member in the Romanian parliament is because it's required by law, if they hit a certain standard, to have a member. So really, this is not someone who really, I think they maybe got like 3,000 to 4,000 votes in the last election in Romania. So this isn't someone who truly was elected by popular support in the normal way. Now, what I want to talk about today that can help you understand this, besides me just giving you all these facts and really get to the meat of why this is occurring, is something I call embedded stasis obligations. Now, really what this is, you can think of is built-in incentives and obligations to remain in stasis. This goes from the personal level to the organizational level. And it is wide encompassing, and it wasn't necessarily on purpose, but it is what has led us to the situation where we are truly stagnant. As many of you probably know, a lot of the more creative types, a lot of the more revolutionary people have been pushed away. And at the end of the day, these incentives and obligations within Rusyn organizations, and just for people in general, they not only they not only hamper growth, but they literally set boundaries, metaphysical boundaries, that if they are crossed, you're essentially going to be weeded out automatically. And I'll get into a couple of these in real life. And so if we go to specific obligations and incentives, these are very apparent when you look a bit deeper. Of course, career, what I mean by this is that a large percentage of our leadership, of our intelligentsia as Rusyns, are academics, or they work for national governments. Now, what does this mean from an obligation and incentives perspective? Well, for the academic, they have to be non-partial, or at least present as though they are non-partial, to be taken seriously in their field. not doing that, by having this situation where so many people are activists, essentially you crowd out, essentially you have a situation where they cannot advocate for Rusyns to the furthest extent they probably should. And of course, for the many people who are probably wonderful individuals but work for national governments, they are obligated not to work against the state, and also they have incentive to not crush their career. In terms of funding, we can think of this as primarily in Europe, but also in some ways in America, where, if you didn't know, many of the largest Russian organizations in Europe rely heavily on government funding. Now, what this means in real political terms is that they cannot do anything that jeopardizes this funding, because if they do, it will be pulled and they will close and they can do nothing. So the reality is that they have to work within these very specific boundaries, not push too far, not rock the boat, and they instead of actually making change, oftentimes there's a facade put on to act as though they are being revolutionary when really they are acting quite safe. Safety is self-explanatory, especially for those in Ukraine. Ideological boundaries, this I found very apparent through my experiences within the Russian American intelligentsia, is that any situation in which someone was particularly patriotic or nationalistic about their Russianness was looked down upon. It's very much, especially in the diaspora, an international image. I believe John Rigetti told me in an interview long ago, he said that it was a good thing that we did not have a state, because we got to focus on cultural matters, and essentially that we don't need a state because, culture and all this is all we need. I don't believe that to be accurate. In some ways, I think it is coping for failures, but in another, this is a very powerful message that's running through the current leadership. And also, I think it's important to mention the last one of that. The majority of Russian organizations in North America are based off of membership. And because of this, they have to work with what the membership wants. Now, what does this mean? It means oftentimes catering to the lowest common denominator and being deathly afraid of going against what the majority of people want. Now, that's okay if you truly are a membership organization, but there's this double game that is played with places like CRS, with many others, that they act as though they're an activist, an ideological organization, and yet they are really structurally a social one. And so they're stuck between these two, where they get all the funding and all the support that an activist organization would have, and yet are constrained by the limits of a membership one. And so if you see now, if for CRS, the majority of their work is through what? Genealogy presentations. It's through some type of bi-yearly newspaper. And these are all okay, except it's this dual orientation of activism and social. So this is another thing that's not specifically, not something I want to focus on too hard in this presentation, but I think it's important to understand where a lot of this comes from. Now, I think this right here is a perfect representation of what is wrong in Russian activism as we see it today. Now, who made this? Well, it was CRS that made this. It was for the New Russian Times. It was their official stance in here. And as you can see, it reads, the Carpatho-Rusyn community stands with Ukraine and condemns Russian aggression. Carpatho-Rusyns live in Ukraine, and Carpatho-Rusyns are fighting for Ukraine.
The carpatho-rusyn community has always supported the territorial integrity of Ukraine. We carpatho-rusyns know how tyrants and autocrats have tried throughout history to destroy us, and so we defend the free, democratic world and a free and democratic Ukraine. As carpatho-rusyns, we fully support Ukraine's bid to join the European Union. We express our deepest solidarity with all the people of Ukraine as they bravely defend themselves against an unprovoked invasion, bury and mourn their dead, and support millions of displaced persons. Now, I think you know what is wrong with this. Of course, there's no mention of how Ukraine has treated us the last 30 years, nor how Ukrainian ideology has attempted to absorb Rusynness into their own national story. There's no mention of we can fully support Ukraine's bid to join the European Union on the condition that they recognize Rusyns. That is a rather awkward wording, but this post is emblematic of what our current intelligentsia stands for. And well, why is this? Again, we can go back to the obligations of the majority of the board is either academics or career professionals. They get funding from the membership. And also these ideological boundaries here of pushing this internationalist perspective. And in return, as we can probably notice as of late, nothing much has been gained from it. If anything, it seems as though Ukraine has backslided on the democratic front. And so it's places like this where you can really see where things have failed. Now, one also note to attach to this that I wrote in my article about why the carpatho-rusyn society needs to die is that they didn't only go this far. They went so far as to many of the people who are on the board of CRS are also part of the carpatho-rusyn consortium of North America. Let's say, think of this as like the top intellectual institution of Rusyns within America and Canada. They wrote a letter to the Rusyn organizations in the homeland, saying that they essentially, I'm paraphrasing here, that they were quite disappointed that these Rusyn organizations supported Ukraine, but then mentioned that Ukraine hasn't treated them well, and that they want to approve all messages that these Rusyn organizations in the homeland write as part of the World Congress of Rusyns, and that just goes to show how incompetent we are. And so, but many people don't recognize these things have occurred. They don't understand the background behind what is really going on, or what is the stance. All anyone hears is that, oh, we are improving. We are these we are these vanguards who are going forward and improving the condition of Rusyns. These very nitty-gritty political topics are ignored. So I should say here too, when talking about these embedded stasis obligations, and when you're looking at your own organization that you're a part of, or just one that you're interested in observing, it's important to note that a lot of these have often weren't started like that. This picture, I believe, I could be wrong, is from the first ever World Congress. And a lot of these people who began many of the organizations after 1989, but then after 1991, really, they had a true goal in mind. And essentially what I believe happened, and what, if you kind of look back at the history, you can see this transition, is that it went from people who were very much everyday regular people, more revolutionary types, as these organizations got bigger, as the funding pool from the EU expanded, as Slovakia and Poland and Hungary and Czechia joined the EU, the opportunity for national funding became available. And so what you see is that while some of this first rung of intelligentsia remained, a lot of what happened was that these original people were essentially replaced by institutional players. And when I say institutional players, I mean those that will play the game, so to speak. And so a lot of these schools, you can see how more radical things were back then, of even having a self-autonomy vote in Zakarpattia in 1991. A lot of these more radical things moved away. We made some pretty intense success in terms of having Rusyns be recognized as a national minority, but then again, this kind of rot from the inside took hold, and where really company men and people who wanted to play the game to get government funding really seeped into these places and took control. So when you're thinking about how things happened, I don't necessarily think it's a positive, like to see, hey, this place has an extreme amount of embedded stasis obligations. That means these people are bad, the original setup was bad. It's very complicated, and you kind of, as you see, it's oftentimes a natural process in any company or organization to kind of go from the revolutionary stage to this kind of institutional player stage. So I think what we can do to change the situation is very simple, and I lay it out in 4 real points. I think the first thing that we can do is the promotion of a more sovereignty-based Russian nationalism with a focus on the reconstitution of former ethnic inhabitation. Now, what exactly does this mean? Well, essentially focusing not so much on having us be free, having us being able to have festivals, but actually saying, hey, we want some type of autonomy in some places, some more politically active part of our society. We want a Rusyn party, perhaps, but pushing this forward in the sense of taking control of our own destiny and being able to kind of reincorporate many of the areas that were assimilated into this. It's a vision that is forward-focusing and not just one of, hey, essentially we're free now and we just want to forever remain free. It's not a very compelling narrative to just have that. I think, again, too, to do this really depends on a new group of radical people displacing many of the current institutions, especially ones that are not tied to the national apparatuses of these places. And that means that the rejection of cooperation and funding, the rejection of many cooperative efforts that really do no benefit to Rusyns themselves. And it really is taking this radical angle. I don't necessarily mean separatism here. I just mean in the sense that we advocate for ourselves to lead ourselves in no way, shape, or form, really now. And to even attempt to do that will create, I think, a domino effect, really, in making it more compelling. And then I think a last one that is quite important, especially for those of you who are watching that are interested in becoming a leader, becoming a member of the kind of leadership, is to really reject the folk-based identity that we currently have. We should not treat our own culture as a museum, but have a desire to evolve it into the 21st century while keeping the most beautiful elements of this original past. And the only way we can get to having a more sovereignty-based Russian nationalism is really the rejection of the current folk-based identity in most of its forms. And so this really gets to the end of the main part. Does anybody have any questions? Just think on these simple 2 sentences. The change to the current Rusyn condition will not come from our current leadership or organizations. The embedded stasis obligations within them are too great to be able to truly rectify from the inside. It requires a certain displacement of the old for the new to thrive. And with that, thank you for attending our third workshop, and we'll move on to the discussion session.